Sometimes life has a way of teaching lessons when we least expect them. Sometimes karma works faster than anyone could imagine. And sometimes the quietest person in the room holds more power than the loudest bully ever realized. What happened in Lincoln High School's cafeteria on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon would become the story everyone talked about for years. It started with a slap that echoed through the silent room, followed by a scream that no one saw coming. In less than 60 seconds, a typical high school power dynamic flipped completely upside down. This is the true story of how Marcus Chen learned that picking on the wrong person can change everything in an instant. It's about Emma Rodriguez, the girl who never spoke up but had been quietly mastering something that would shock everyone. And it's about how one moment of cruelty led to a consequence so swift and unexpected that it left an entire school questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, justice, and the quiet power that lives inside the most unlikely heroes. What you're about to read really happened. The names have been changed, but every detail, every emotion, and every shocking twist is exactly as it occurred in a small town where everyone thought they knew everyone else's story. Emma Rodriguez sat at the same corner table in Lincoln High School's cafeteria every single day. The table was strategically positioned near the emergency exit, far from the popular kids' territory, and close enough to the kitchen that the lunch staff could keep an eye on things. She preferred it that way. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant she could eat her homemade lunch in peace while sketching in her worn notebook. Nobody really knew Emma, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She had transferred to Lincoln High at the beginning of junior year when her father's construction job moved the family from Phoenix to this small Colorado town. The transition had been rough. Moving in the middle of high school meant everyone already had their friend groups, their established routines, their unspoken hierarchies. Emma found it easier to slip into the background than to fight for a place she wasn't sure she wanted anyway. Her teachers knew her as the student who always turned in perfect assignments but never raised her hand. Her classmates knew her as the girl with the long black hair who carried art supplies everywhere and spoke so quietly that most people had to ask her to repeat herself. What they didn't know was that Emma had been practicing martial arts since she was 7 years old. What they couldn't see was the strength she'd built through years of discipline, focus, and determination. Back in Phoenix, Emma had been a different person. She'd been confident, outgoing, and proud of her accomplishments in Taekwondo. She'd earned her black belt at 14 and had been competing in regional tournaments. But the move had changed everything. Her new school didn't have a martial arts program. The nearest dojo was 40 minutes away, and with her father working long hours and her mother juggling 2 part-time jobs, transportation was complicated. Emma had tried to maintain her training at home, practicing forms in her backyard and keeping up with her conditioning. But it wasn't the same as having a proper instructor and training partners. The isolation had gradually worn her down. In Phoenix, she'd been Emma the competitor, Emma the martial artist, Emma the girl who could hold her own. Here, she was just the weird new girl who kept to herself. She tried making friends in those first few weeks, but the social dynamics of Lincoln High were different from what she was used to. The popular kids ruled with an iron fist, and anyone who didn't fit their mold was either ignored or targeted. Marcus Chen was the undisputed king of Lincoln High's social hierarchy. At 17, he was tall, athletic, and came from one of the wealthiest families in town. His father owned the largest car dealership in the county, and Marcus never let anyone forget it. He drove a brand new BMW to school, wore designer clothes, and had a different girlfriend every few months. But what really gave Marcus power was his willingness to use cruelty as a tool for maintaining his status. Marcus had a gift for finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them. He could spot insecurity from across the room and knew exactly how to make someone feel small with just a few words. He surrounded himself with followers who laughed at his jokes and enabled his behavior because they'd rather be on his side than in his crosshairs. The teachers either didn't see what he was doing or chose to look the other way because his family donated generously to the school. Emma had managed to stay off Marcus's radar for most of junior year. She kept her head down, minded her own business, and avoided any situation where she might draw attention to herself. But as senior year began, something had shifted. Maybe Marcus was bored. Maybe he felt like he needed to assert his dominance over the new batch of students. Or maybe he'd finally noticed the quiet girl in the corner who seemed completely immune to the social dynamics that controlled everyone else. It started small. A comment about her clothes when she walked past his table. A laugh when she dropped her books in the hallway. Nothing that crossed any major lines, but enough to let her know she was on his radar. Emma tried to ignore it, hoping that if she didn't react, he'd lose interest and move on to someone else. But Marcus wasn't the type to lose interest when someone didn't give him the reaction he wanted. If anything, Emma's lack of response seemed to intrigue him more. He began testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before she'd finally break. He'd make comments loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough that teachers couldn't prove he was targeting her specifically. He'd bump into her in the hallways and act like it was an accident. He'd encourage his friends to join in, creating a subtle but persistent campaign of harassment. Emma's art became her escape. During lunch, she'd lose herself in sketching, creating detailed drawings of landscapes and fantasy scenes that transported her away from the suffocating atmosphere of high school politics. Her notebook was filled with dragons soaring over mountains, peaceful forests with hidden waterfalls, and warriors standing strong against impossible odds. The drawings were her way of processing emotions she couldn't express out loud. Ms. Patricia Kellerman, the art teacher, had noticed Emma's talent early on. She'd tried several times to encourage Emma to join the art club or submit pieces to contests, but Emma always politely declined. She wasn't ready to put herself out there, to risk having something she cared about become another target for criticism or mockery. Art was her private sanctuary, and she wasn't willing to share it with people who might not understand. At home, Emma's parents were dealing with their own struggles. Her father, Miguel, was working 12-hour days trying to establish himself with a new construction company. The work was physically demanding, and the pay was lower than what he'd made in Phoenix. Her mother, Sophia, had taken on 2 part-time jobs, one at a local grocery store and another cleaning offices in the evening. The stress was wearing on the family, and Emma didn't want to add to their burdens by complaining about social problems at school. She'd tried to bring up the possibility of returning to martial arts training, but the conversation never seemed to go anywhere. Her parents were supportive in theory, but the practical realities of time and money made it seem impossible. The nearest quality dojo was expensive, and with gas prices and the family's tight budget, regular trips would be a significant strain. So Emma continued her solitary routine. She'd wake up early to practice forms in her backyard before school, trying to maintain the muscle memory and technique she'd spent years developing. She'd do conditioning exercises in her room at night, keeping her strength and flexibility as best she could without proper equipment or instruction. But she could feel herself losing the sharp edge she'd once had. The confidence that came from knowing she could defend herself was gradually fading. The other students at Lincoln High had no idea what Emma was capable of. They saw a quiet, artistic girl who kept to herself and seemed almost fragile. They didn't know about the years of training, the tournament she'd won, or the black belt hanging in her closet back home. Emma had made a conscious decision not to mention her martial arts background to anyone at school. It felt like bragging, and more importantly, it felt like revealing a vulnerability. If people knew she could fight, they might expect her to prove it, and Emma wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of attention. Marcus's campaign of harassment continued throughout the fall semester. He seemed to view Emma as a puzzle to solve, a challenge that required persistence. His friends had started joining in more actively, making comments about her appearance, her clothes, her accent when she occasionally spoke up in class. They'd developed a game of seeing who could get the strongest reaction from her, but Emma refused to give them the satisfaction. She'd learned to time her movements through the school to avoid Marcus and his group as much as possible. She knew their schedules, their hangout spots, their patterns. She'd take longer routes to class if it meant avoiding confrontation. She'd eat lunch quickly and then find somewhere else to spend the remainder of the period. But in a school of only 800 students, complete avoidance was impossible. The breaking point was approaching, though none of them knew it yet. Emma's patience was wearing thin, and her carefully maintained self-control was beginning to crack. The stress of constant vigilance was exhausting. The frustration of being targeted for no reason other than Marcus's entertainment was building pressure inside her like a volcano waiting to erupt. Her art had begun to change too. The peaceful landscapes were gradually being replaced by more intense scenes, warriors in battle, storms destroying peaceful villages, dragons breathing fire on those who threatened the innocent. The images coming from her pencil reflected the anger she was working so hard to keep buried. Ms. Kellerman had noticed the shift but wasn't sure how to address it without overstepping boundaries. At home, Emma's parents were finally starting to notice that something was wrong. She'd become even quieter than usual, more withdrawn. Her grades were still excellent, but she seemed to have lost the spark of curiosity that had always driven her learning. When they asked about school, she gave generic responses that revealed nothing about her daily struggles. Miguel and Sofia Rodriguez had immigrated to the United States when Emma was 3 years old, seeking better opportunities for their family. They'd worked hard to provide stability and education for their daughter, always emphasizing the importance of focusing on studies and staying out of trouble. They trusted Emma to handle normal teenage challenges on her own, but they were starting to sense that something bigger was happening. The Tuesday that would change everything started like any other day. Emma woke up at 6:30, did her morning practice routine in the backyard, showered, and prepared for school. She packed her usual lunch, grabbed her art supplies and books, and walked the 12 blocks to Lincoln High. She was wearing her favorite jeans and a simple blue sweater that her grandmother had given her for her birthday. During first period English, Marcus made a comment about her presentation on Latino authors in American literature. It was subtle enough that Mrs. Patterson didn't catch it, but clear enough that Emma understood she was being mocked for her heritage. During third period chemistry, one of Marcus's friends accidentally knocked her notebook off her desk, scattering her carefully organized notes across the floor. By lunch, Emma was feeling the familiar tension that came from a morning of microaggressions and targeted harassment. She sat at her usual corner table, pulled out her lunch, and opened a sketchbook to work on a drawing she'd started the day before. It was a scene of a young warrior standing alone against a group of enemies, outnumbered but not afraid. As she worked on the details of the warrior's stance, Emma found herself thinking about her old life in Phoenix, about the confidence she used to feel, about the person she used to be. The cafeteria was buzzing with the usual lunchtime energy. Students clustered at their assigned tables, trading gossip, complaining about teachers, and planning weekend activities. The popular kids held court at the center tables, their voices carrying across the room as they discussed parties and relationships. Marcus sat at the head of his usual table, regaling his audience with some story that had them all laughing loudly. Emma was so focused on her drawing that she didn't notice Marcus getting up from his table. She didn't see him walking in her direction with that predatory smile he wore when he was planning something cruel. She didn't realize that today was going to be different until it was too late to prepare herself for what was coming. The moment that would change everything was less than 5 minutes away, and neither Emma nor Marcus had any idea that their lives were about to intersect in a way that would shock everyone who witnessed it. The quiet girl in the corner was about to remind the world that still waters run deep, and that underestimating someone based on their silence could be a very dangerous mistake. Marcus approached Emma's table with the confident swagger that had become his trademark. Behind him, his usual crew of followers sensed entertainment coming and began to gather at a respectful distance. Jake Morrison, Marcus's closest friend and enabler, pulled out his phone to record whatever was about to happen. Social media had turned bullying into performance art, and Marcus never missed an opportunity to create content that would boost his online reputation. Emma was completely absorbed in her artwork, adding delicate shading to the warrior's armor when Marcus's shadow fell across her paper. She looked up slowly, already knowing who she'd find standing there, but hoping against hope that he'd just keep walking. Marcus was smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. It was the predatory grin of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Marcus said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "The little artist is drawing again. Mind if I take a look?" Without waiting for permission, Marcus reached down and grabbed Emma's sketchbook, pulling it away from her protective hands. Emma's heart started racing. This wasn't like his usual comments or shoulder bumps. This was a direct violation of her personal space, an invasion of the one thing that belonged completely to her. "Please give that back," Emma said quietly, reaching for her notebook. Her voice was steady, but inside she could feel something shifting. The careful control she'd maintained for months was starting to crack. Marcus held the sketchbook just out of her reach, flipping through pages of her most personal artwork. His friends gathered closer, peering over his shoulder at the detailed drawings Emma had created during countless lunch periods. They began commenting on the images, making jokes about the fantasy themes and the obvious skill in the artwork. "Wow, she's actually pretty good," said Ashley Martinez, one of the girls in Marcus's circle. "These are really detailed." "Yeah, but what's with all the warrior stuff?" laughed Tommy Rodriguez, no relation to Emma despite sharing a surname. "Does little Emma think she's some kind of fighter?" Marcus stopped at the drawing Emma had been working on, the lone warrior facing multiple enemies. He studied it for a moment, and something in his expression changed. The image seemed to strike a nerve, perhaps because on some level he recognized himself as one of the attacking figures surrounding the isolated hero. "This is interesting," Marcus said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Is this supposed to be you, Emma, the brave little warrior standing up to the big bad bullies?" The cafeteria had grown quieter. Other students were beginning to notice the confrontation, and conversations at nearby tables were dying down as people turned to watch. Emma could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she'd respond to this very public humiliation. "It's just a drawing," Emma said, standing up slowly. "Please give me my notebook back." But Marcus wasn't done. He'd found something that seemed to genuinely irritate him about the drawing. Some challenge to his worldview that he couldn't let slide. Maybe it was the fact that the warrior in the image looked confident and strong despite being outnumbered. Maybe it was the defiant stance that reminded him too much of Emma's refusal to properly submit to his harassment campaign. "Just a drawing?" Marcus repeated mockingly. "Come on, Emma. We both know this is about more than art. This is your little fantasy world where you're tough enough to stand up for yourself. But this isn't a drawing, is it? This is real life." He held the sketchbook higher, completely out of Emma's reach now. At 5 feet 2, she had no way to grab it without jumping or asking for help. Marcus was enjoying the power dynamic, the way she was forced to look up at him while he controlled something that belonged to her. "You know what I think?" Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. "I think you need a reality check. All this warrior princess fantasy stuff is cute, but you're not fooling anyone. You're just a scared little girl who's too weak to even ask for her own property back." Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that used to come before tournaments, the heightened awareness that preceded combat. But this wasn't a controlled environment with rules and referees. This was her real life, in front of real people, with real consequences for whatever happened next. "Give me my notebook," she said again. But this time her voice was different. There was steel in it that hadn't been there before. A firmness that made several of Marcus's friends exchange glances. Marcus noticed the change too, and it seemed to excite rather than warn him. He'd finally gotten a reaction, finally cracked through Emma's maddeningly calm exterior. This was what he'd been working toward for months, and he wasn't about to back down just because she'd found her voice. "Oh, now you want to sound tough." Marcus laughed, tossing the sketchbook to Jake, who caught it and immediately started flipping through more pages. "What are you going to do about it, warrior princess? You going to fight me for it?" The crowd around them was growing larger. Word was spreading through the cafeteria that something was happening, and students were abandoning their lunches to get a better view. Some were holding up phones to record the confrontation, sensing that this was building towards something worth capturing. Emma could see Miss Patterson, the lunch monitor, starting to move in their direction from across the room. But she was dealing with a spilled tray situation near the serving line, and it would take her at least a minute to reach Emma's corner. A minute could feel like an eternity in a situation like this, and Emma knew that whatever was going to happen would be over long before any adult intervention arrived. "I'm asking nicely," Emma said, taking a step toward Jake to retrieve her notebook. "Please give it back." But Jake, emboldened by Marcus's leadership and the audience they'd attracted, held the notebook away from her just like Marcus had done. "I don't think so," he said with a grin. "We're not done looking at your little fantasy drawings yet." That's when Tommy grabbed a pencil from Emma's art supply case and started pretending to add his own drawings to her pages. He wasn't actually marking the paper, but the gesture was clear enough. He was threatening to destroy months of Emma's work, to vandalize the one thing that had been keeping her sane through this ordeal. "Stop," Emma said sharply, reaching for Tommy's hand. "Don't touch my drawings." Tommy pulled back dramatically, as if Emma had tried to attack him. "Whoa, she's getting violent," he announced to the crowd. "Better be careful, guys. The artist is dangerous." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow to Emma. She was being mocked not just for standing up for herself, but for caring about her art, for having something that mattered to her. The humiliation was complete and devastating, designed to crush any spirit she had left. Marcus could see that Emma was close to tears, and he decided to push for the final victory. He wanted complete submission, absolute proof that his dominance was unshakable. He wanted her to beg. "You know what, Emma?" Marcus said, moving closer until he was standing directly in front of her. "I think you need to learn some respect. Maybe if you ask me very nicely, get down on your knees and apologize for being so rude to my friends, maybe then we'll give you back your little coloring book." The cafeteria went completely silent. Even for Marcus, this was going too far. Several students in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the line between teasing and genuine cruelty had been crossed. But no one spoke up, no one moved to intervene. The social hierarchy that gave Marcus power also protected him from consequences, and everyone knew it. Emma stood perfectly still for a moment. That seemed to stretch forever. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the expectation that she would comply, that she would accept this final humiliation because fighting back seemed impossible. The old Emma, the confident martial artist from Phoenix, would have never let things get this far. But that Emma felt like a different person from a different life. "No," she said quietly. Marcus either didn't hear her or chose to pretend he hadn't. "What was that? Speak up, Emma. We can't hear you back there." "No," Emma repeated, louder this time. "I won't get on my knees. I won't apologize. And I want my notebook back right now. The change in Marcus's expression was immediate and dramatic. The playful cruelty disappeared, replaced by genuine anger. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not in front of an audience. His entire social structure depended on people knowing their place and accepting his authority without question. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't think you understand what's happening here. This isn't a negotiation." He took another step forward, invading Emma's personal space completely. They were now close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the rage building behind his eyes. This was no longer about the notebook or even about humiliation. This was about power, and Marcus couldn't allow his authority to be questioned in front of half the school. "You have two choices," Marcus continued. "You can do what I told you to do, or you can try to take your notebook back by force. But we both know how that would end, don't we? You're not strong enough to fight me, Emma. You're not strong enough to fight any of us." Emma's training had taught her to recognize the moment when a confrontation moved from words to potential violence. She could see it in Marcus's posture, in the way his hands were positioned, in the energy radiating from his body. He was preparing to escalate this beyond verbal harassment, and she had seconds to decide how to respond. Everything her parents had taught her said to walk away, to find an adult, to de-escalate and avoid confrontation. Everything her martial arts instructors had taught her said to defend herself only when absolutely necessary, to use the minimum force required to neutralize a threat. But everything inside her, everything that had been building up for months of harassment and humiliation, was screaming for justice. "Last chance," Marcus said, holding his hand out like he expected Emma to drop to her knees right there in front of everyone. Emma looked around the cafeteria at all the faces watching her. She saw students with their phones out, recording her moment of decision for posterity. She saw some expressions of sympathy, others of excitement at the drama, and many that seemed to be silently willing her to just give up and submit. Then she saw Miss Patterson still struggling to reach them through the crowd of spectators. She saw the lunch staff pretending not to notice what was happening. She saw all the systems that were supposed to protect students like her failing completely, leaving her alone to face a situation that no teenager should have to navigate. And in that moment, Emma made a choice that would change everything. "No," she said one final time, meeting Marcus's eyes with a steadiness that surprised both of them. "I won't kneel to you. And if you want to make this physical, then bring it on." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a duel. Marcus's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, disbelief, and finally rage. He couldn't back down now, not with everyone watching, not after being defied so publicly by someone he considered beneath his notice. What happened next would be talked about at Lincoln High for years to come. It would be dissected and analyzed and mythologized until the truth became almost impossible to separate from the legend. But in that moment, as Marcus raised his hand and Emma shifted into a defensive stance that no one had ever seen her use before, time seemed to slow down to allow everyone to appreciate the magnitude of what they were about to witness. The quiet girl in the corner was about to remind everyone that there's a difference between choosing silence and being silenced. And Marcus Chen was about to learn that sometimes the people you underestimate are the most dangerous ones of all. Marcus's hand moved in what seemed like slow motion to everyone watching. The slap was meant to be the final humiliation, the ultimate demonstration of his power over Emma and everyone else in that cafeteria. He had calculated it perfectly, or so he thought. A single strike that would send the message that defiance had consequences, that challenging his authority would result in immediate and public punishment. The sound of his palm connecting with Emma's cheek cracked through the silence like a whip. The force of the blow turned her head to the side and left a bright red handprint on her face. For a moment, everything was exactly as Marcus had planned. Emma stood there, stunned, one hand slowly rising to touch her burning cheek. The crowd gasped collectively, some students stepping backward as if physical violence was contagious. But then Emma turned her head back to face Marcus, and something in her eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. The girl who had been quiet and submissive for months was gone, replaced by someone Marcus didn't recognize. There was no fear in her expression, no tears, no surrender. Instead, there was a cold, calculating fury that seemed to radiate from her entire being. "Wrong move," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria. Marcus tried to maintain his confident facade, but something about Emma's reaction was unsettling him. This wasn't how victims were supposed to respond. They were supposed to cry or run away, or at least show some sign that his display of dominance had worked. Instead, Emma looked like she was evaluating him, sizing him up like a fighter studying an opponent. "What are you going to do about it?" Marcus demanded, but there was a slight tremor in his voice now. "Hit me back? We both know you don't have it in you." Emma's response was to shift her weight slightly, adjusting her stance in a way that looked casual to most observers, but would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with martial arts training. Her feet moved to shoulder-width apart, her right foot sliding back just enough to provide better balance and leverage. Her hands dropped to her sides, but her fingers curled slightly, ready to react instantly to any threat. "You're right," Emma said calmly. "I don't want to hit you, but you just assaulted me in front of 50 witnesses. So now we're not talking about what I want to do, we're talking about what I'm going to do if you don't back away from me right now." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of this confrontation. Marcus looked around at the faces watching him, expecting to see the usual support and encouragement for his dominance games. Instead, he saw uncertainty, concern, and in some cases, anticipation that wasn't entirely friendly toward him. Jake Morrison, still holding Emma's sketchbook, tried to break the tension with forced laughter. "Come on, Marcus, let's just go. This is getting weird." But Marcus couldn't let it go. His entire identity was built on being the person who won these confrontations, who never backed down, who always came out on top. Walking away now would be seen as weakness, and weakness wasn't something his carefully constructed image could survive. "You're threatening me?"
Marcus said, taking a step closer to Emma, instead of backing away.
"You think you're some kind of tough girl now because you can talk back?" Emma didn't move, but everyone could see the tension building in her muscles. She looked like a coiled spring, ready to explode into action. "I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you. There's a difference." Marcus reached out to grab Emma's shoulder, perhaps intending to shake her or push her down. It was meant to be another display of his physical dominance, proof that he could put his hands on her whenever he wanted. But the moment his fingers made contact with her sweater, Emma moved. What happened next was so fast that most people didn't see the individual movements, only the result. Emma's left hand came up in a sharp arc, slapping Marcus's reaching hand away from her body. Simultaneously, her right hand grabbed his wrist and she stepped forward while rotating her hips. The technique was a basic self-defense move called an arm drag, designed to use an attacker's momentum against them. Marcus found himself suddenly off balance, his arm extended and twisted in a way that left him vulnerable. Emma had control of his wrist and was standing at an angle that gave her maximum leverage while minimizing his ability to counter. For someone who had trained in martial arts, it was as natural as breathing. For Marcus, who had never faced any real physical resistance to his bullying, it was completely shocking. "Let go of me," Marcus demanded, trying to pull his arm free. But Emma's grip was stronger than he'd expected, and the angle she had created made it impossible for him to use his size advantage effectively. "Gladly," Emma said, "as soon as you apologize for hitting me and give me back my notebook." The crowd pressed closer, phones held high to capture every moment of this unprecedented reversal. Marcus Chen, the undisputed king of Lincoln High, was being controlled by Emma Rodriguez, the quiet girl nobody had ever paid attention to. The social order that had seemed permanent and unchangeable was cracking before their eyes. Marcus's face was turning red with embarrassment and anger. He could hear students murmuring, could see the phones recording his humiliation. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, and instead it was becoming his worst nightmare. In desperation, he swung his free hand toward Emma's face, hoping to break her hold and reassert his dominance. But Emma saw the punch coming from the moment Marcus's shoulder tensed. Years of training had taught her to read body language, to anticipate attacks before they fully developed. She ducked under the wild swing easily, maintaining her grip on Marcus's captured wrist while his momentum carried him off balance. That's when Emma decided to end this once and for all. She could have simply released Marcus and stepped away, satisfied with proving her point. She could have waited for Miss Pizzaloo, Patterson to finally reach them and let an adult handle the situation. But Marcus had crossed a line when he struck her, and Emma's patience for his behavior had run out completely. Using Marcus's own forward momentum against him, Emma stepped to the side and applied pressure to his trapped wrist while sweeping his lead leg with her foot. The technique was called a sacrifice throw in jiu-jitsu, designed to take down an opponent while maintaining control. Marcus went down hard, his feet flying out from under him as Emma guided his fall to ensure maximum impact. But Emma wasn't done. As Marcus hit the floor, she maintained her grip on his wrist and immediately applied an armbar. a submission hold that put tremendous pressure on the elbow joint. Marcus's arm was now extended and locked in a position where Emma could control him completely with minimal effort. "Stop! Stop!" Marcus screamed, as pain shot through his elbow. "You're breaking my arm." Emma applied just enough pressure to make her point clear. "I'm not breaking anything. Yet. But I could, very easily. This is called an armbar, and right now I have complete control over your elbow joint. If I wanted to, I could snap it like a twig." The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Students were shouting, some cheering for Emma, others calling for teachers, many just screaming in shock at what they were witnessing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Quiet girls didn't take down popular boys. Victims didn't suddenly become victors. The natural order of high school hierarchy wasn't supposed to be so easily overturned. Marcus was writhing on the floor, trying desperately to escape Emma's hold, but every movement only made the pressure on his elbow more painful. He was trapped, completely at the mercy of someone he had dismissed as weak and helpless. The humiliation was total and devastating. "Please!" Marcus gasped, all his bravado completely gone. "Please let me go. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hit you." Emma looked down at him calmly. "Are you really sorry? Or are you just scared because you're finally on the receiving end for once?" "I'm sorry," Marcus repeated desperately. "I'm really sorry. I won't bother you anymore." But Emma wasn't satisfied with a forced apology extracted under duress. She wanted justice, real accountability for months of harassment and humiliation. "Jake," she called out, without taking her eyes off Marcus. "Bring me my notebook, now." Jake Morrison stood frozen, still holding Emma's sketchbook, but clearly afraid to get any closer to the girl who had just taken down his supposedly invincible leader. Now," Emma repeated, adding slightly more pressure to Marcus's elbow. The increased pain made Marcus scream again, which motivated Jake to quickly approach and place the notebook within Emma's reach. Ms. Patterson was finally pushing through the crowd of students, shouting for everyone to back away and demanding to know what was happening. But she was still several yards away, and Emma knew she had only seconds left before adult intervention would complicate everything. "Listen carefully," Emma said to Marcus, her voice deadly calm. "You're going to stop bothering me, you're going to stop bothering everyone else too, because I'll be watching. And if you ever put your hands on another student again, I'll make sure everyone remembers this moment. Do you understand me?" Marcus nodded frantically, tears of pain and humiliation streaming down his face. Yes, I understand. Just please let me go." Emma held the position for one more second, making sure everyone in the cafeteria could see exactly who was in control. Then she released the armbar and stood up smoothly, grabbing her sketchbook and art supplies in one fluid motion. Marcus rolled onto his side, clutching his elbow and gasping in pain and relief. He tried to stand up quickly, to salvage some dignity from the situation, but his legs were shaky and his elbow was throbbing. The movement sent another spike of pain through his arm, and he stumbled, nearly falling again. That's when Marcus made his final, fatal mistake. Whether it was pride, anger, or simple inability to accept that he had been beaten, he lunged toward Emma one more time. Maybe he thought he could catch her off guard while she was collecting her belongings. Maybe he thought he could redeem himself with one desperate attack. Emma saw him coming and reacted instinctively. This time there was no hesitation, no attempt to control or subdue. Marcus had proven that he couldn't be trusted to stay down, that he would keep coming until he was completely unable to continue. Emma's response was swift, precise, and devastating. She stepped into Marcus's charge and drove her elbow upward into his descending arm with perfect timing and technique. The impact was exactly what her instructors had taught her to aim for, a precise strike to the elbow joint at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The sound of Marcus's elbow breaking was audible throughout the cafeteria, a sharp crack that made everyone wince, and several students cry out in horror. Marcus's scream was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before, a sound of pure agony that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He collapsed to the floor immediately, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, clutching the injury while tears poured down his face. The confident, cruel boy who had terrorized students for years was gone, replaced by a broken, sobbing teenager who was learning that actions have consequences. Emma stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, but otherwise showing no sign of the adrenaline that must have been coursing through her system. She looked around the silent cafeteria, at all the faces staring at her, in shock, amazement, and newfound respect. "Don't ever touch me again," she said quietly. But her words carried clearly through the silence. Then she picked up her remaining art supplies, tucked a sketchbook under her arm, and walked calmly toward the cafeteria exit while Marcus continued to scream behind her. The crowd parted automatically to let her pass, and no one tried to stop her. Miss Patterson finally reached Marcus and immediately began calling for medical assistance while trying to assess his injuries. Other teachers and staff members rushed to the scene, creating a chaos of adult voices and emergency procedures. But Emma was already gone, walking down the empty hallway toward the school nurse's office to report that she had been assaulted and had defended herself accordingly. She was calm, composed, and ready to face whatever consequences might come from her actions. Behind her, Marcus Chen lay on the cafeteria floor, with his elbow shattered and his reign of terror finally ended. The quiet girl in the corner had spoken at last, and her message had been delivered with devastating clarity. The next 24 hours at Lincoln High School were unlike anything in the institution's 70-year history. By the time the paramedics had loaded Marcus Chen into an ambulance and driven him to County General Hospital, cell phone videos of the cafeteria confrontation were already spreading through social media like wildfire. Students who hadn't even been present were claiming they'd witnessed the moment when the quiet girl had brought down the school's biggest bully. Emma Rodriguez sat in Principal Davidson's office, her hands folded calmly in her lap while chaos erupted around her. Her parents had been called and were racing to the school. Marcus's parents were at the hospital, demanding that charges be filed against Emma. The school board was convening an emergency meeting, and every few minutes, Principal Davidson's phone rang with calls from local news stations who had somehow already heard about the incident. "Emma," Principal Davidson said for the third time, removing his glasses to clean them nervously. "I need you to understand how serious this situation is. Marcus is in surgery right now. His elbow was completely shattered. The doctors aren't sure if he'll ever regain full use of his arm." Emma met his gaze steadily. "I understand that he's hurt. But I also understand that he assaulted me first, in front of 50 witnesses, and when I tried to de-escalate the situation, he continued to attack me. I defended myself." The principal looked exhausted. In 30 years of education, he'd dealt with fights, arguments, and disciplinary problems, but nothing quite like this. Emma's calm, articulate description of events was supported by dozens of cell phone videos that showed Marcus clearly striking her first and continuing to pursue the confrontation even after she'd demonstrated her ability to control him. "The videos show that you had him restrained," Principal Davidson said carefully. "You could have held him until teachers arrived, but instead you chose to seriously injure him." Emma's expression didn't change. "The videos also show that I released him and was collecting my belongings when he chose to attack me again. At that point, I had every right to defend myself using whatever force was necessary to stop the threat." Mrs. Henderson, the school's guidance counselor, leaned forward in her chair. "Emma, where did you learn to fight like that? Those techniques, they look professional." For the first time since entering the office, Emma's composure cracked slightly. "I've been studying martial arts since I was 7. I have a black belt in Taekwondo and some training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I never mentioned it because I hoped I'd never need to use it." The adults in the room exchanged glances. This information changed the dynamic considerably. Emma wasn't just a girl who'd gotten lucky in a fight. She was a trained martial artist who had used her skills against an untrained opponent. "Why didn't you tell anyone about your training, Mrs. Qualpole?" Henderson asked gently. "It might have prevented this situation if Marcus had known you could defend yourself." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Because then people would have expected me to prove it. They would have pushed and prodded until something like this happened anyway. I moved here to start fresh, to avoid the kind of attention that comes with being known as the girl who can fight." But Marcus made that impossible. Principal Davidson's phone rang again, and he glanced at the caller ID before declining the call. "Emma, I have to ask directly. Did you intend to break Marcus's arm?" Emma considered the question carefully. "I intended to stop him from attacking me again. The specific injury was a result of his decision to charge at me while I was defending myself. If he had stayed down after the first time I controlled him, or if he had listened when I warned him to back away, none of this would have happened." The principal made notes on a legal pad, clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. The school's zero-tolerance policy on violence would normally result in immediate suspension or expulsion for both students involved in a fight. But the circumstances were unprecedented. Emma had been the victim of months of documented harassment. She had been struck first, and the videos clearly showed her attempting to de-escalate before defending herself. Miguel and Sofia Rodriguez arrived at the school 40 minutes after the initial phone call, both of them having left work in the middle of the day to respond to the emergency. They entered the principal's office looking concerned but not surprised, as if they'd been expecting something like this for a while. "What happened?" Sophia asked immediately. moving to stand behind Emma's chair with a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. Principal Davidson explained the situation as diplomatically as possible, but the basic facts were undeniable. Emma had seriously injured another student during a physical altercation. The Rodriguezes listened quietly, their expressions growing more serious as they understood the potential consequences their daughter was facing. "Has anyone asked what led up to this fight?" Miguel demanded when the principal finished his explanation. "Because I know my daughter, and she wouldn't hurt someone without a very good reason." Mrs. Henderson consulted her files. "Emma has reported several instances of harassment over the past few months. We've spoken to Marcus about his behavior, but..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable admitting that their interventions had been ineffective. "You spoke to him," Sophia repeated flatly. "What exactly does that mean?" Principal Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "We called Marcus into the office twice to discuss his interactions with Emma. He denied any wrongdoing and claimed it was just friendly teasing that she was misinterpreting." Emma's father stood up abruptly, his construction worker frame filling the small office. "So my daughter reported that she was being bullied. You did nothing effective to stop it. And now you're surprised that she eventually defended herself?" "Mr. Rodriguez, please understand that we have procedures," Principal Davidson began.
Your procedures failed, Miguel interrupted.
"And now my daughter is being treated like a criminal for protecting herself from an attacker." The tension in the room was palpable, but it was interrupted by a knock on the door. Officer Janet Mills of the local police department entered, looking professionally neutral but clearly aware of the complexity of the situation she was walking into. "I need to speak with Emma Rodriguez about the incident that occurred today," Officer Mills said. "I understand she's a minor, so I'll need her parents present for any questioning." Emma answered Officer Mills' questions with the same calm precision she'd shown with the school administrators. She described the months of harassment, the escalation in the cafeteria, Marcus's decision to strike her, her attempts to control the situation without causing harm, and finally her defensive response when Marcus attacked her again after she'd released him. Officer Mills took notes and reviewed several of the cell phone videos that students had already uploaded to social media. The footage was remarkably clear and supported Emma's version of events completely. Marcus was clearly the aggressor, clearly struck first, and clearly chose to continue the confrontation even after being subdued. "Based on what I'm seeing," Officer Mills said finally, "this appears to be a clear case of self-defense. Emma was assaulted, she attempted to de-escalate, and she used reasonable force to protect herself from continued attack." Principal Davidson looked relieved but still troubled. "What about the severity of Marcus's injuries? Doesn't that change things?" "The law doesn't require victims to limit their self-defense to match the level of force used by their attacker," Officer Mills explained. "It allows for reasonable force necessary to stop the threat. If Marcus had stopped his attack after being initially subdued, his injuries wouldn't have occurred. His decision to continue attacking created the situation that resulted in his more serious injury." The legal implications were becoming clear, but the school's disciplinary issues remained complicated. Emma would likely face some consequences for being involved in a fight, regardless of the circumstances. The question was whether those consequences would be proportionate to her actual culpability. Meanwhile, at County General Hospital, Marcus Chen was emerging from surgery with his elbow held together by metal pins and screws. The orthopedic surgeon had managed to repair the shattered joint, but the recovery would be long and painful, and Marcus might never regain full strength and mobility in his arm. Marcus's parents, David and Linda Chen, were furious and looking for someone to blame. David Chen was a successful businessman accustomed to solving problems with money and influence, and he wasn't accepting that his son might have brought this situation on himself through his own behavior.
"I don't care what Marcus said or did,"
David Chen told his wife as they sat in the hospital waiting room. "No one has the right to cripple someone else's child. That girl is going to pay for what she did." But as the videos from the cafeteria continued to spread online, public opinion was not developing in the direction David Chen expected. Comments on social media were overwhelmingly supportive of Emma's actions. Students from Lincoln High were sharing their own stories of being bullied by Marcus and his friends. Parents were expressing outrage that the harassment had been allowed to continue for so long. The story was picked up by local news stations, then regional media, and finally by national outlets that specialized in stories about bullying and school violence. Within 48 hours, Emma Rodriguez had become a symbol for students who felt powerless against bullies, and Marcus Chen had become the face of privileged teenagers who believed they were untouchable. Back at Lincoln High, the atmosphere was electric with tension and excitement. Students who had been afraid of Marcus for years were sharing stories about his behavior that painted a picture of systematic cruelty and intimidation. Teachers who had looked the other way were being questioned about their failure to protect vulnerable students. Emma didn't return to school for the rest of the week. Her parents had decided to keep her home while the legal and disciplinary processes played out. And honestly, Emma wasn't ready to face the attention that would inevitably surround her return to campus. She spent the time at home reflecting on what had happened and what it meant for her future. The quiet, invisible life she had tried to create for herself in this small town was over forever. She would always be known as the girl who had stood up to the bully, the girl who had proven that victims could become victors. On Friday afternoon, Emma received an unexpected visitor. Ms. Patricia Kellerman, her art teacher, stopped by the Rodriguez house with Emma's graded assignments and a personal message. "I wanted you to know," Ms. Kellerman said as they sat in the family's small living room, "that what you did took incredible courage. Not just the physical confrontation, but everything that led up to it. Standing up for yourself after being pushed around for months, refusing to back down when someone tried to humiliate you, that's real strength." Emma looked down at her hands. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be left alone." "I know, Ms. Kellerman said gently. "But sometimes we don't get to choose when we have to stand up for ourselves. What matters is how we respond when that moment comes. You showed Marcus and everyone else that there are consequences for cruelty, that victims don't have to stay victims forever." As the weekend approached, Emma was preparing to return to school on Monday. The principal had decided that while she would receive a 3-day suspension for being involved in a fight, the circumstances clearly showed that she had been defending herself against an unprovoked attack. Marcus, when he was eventually able to return to school, would face much more serious consequences for his pattern of harassment and for initiating the physical confrontation. But the real changes at Lincoln High went far deeper than disciplinary actions. The incident had shattered the invisible power structures that had allowed bullies like Marcus to operate with impunity. Students who had been afraid to speak up were finding their voices. Teachers and administrators were being held accountable for their failure to address harassment effectively. Emma Rodriguez had wanted nothing more than to blend into the background and get through high school without drama. Instead, she had become a catalyst for change, proving that even the quietest person could make the loudest statement when pushed too far. As she prepared to face her classmates again on Monday morning, Emma knew that her life at Lincoln High would never be the same. But for the first time since moving to this small town, she felt like the person she was becoming might be someone worth knowing. Monday morning at Lincoln High School felt like the first day of a different era. Emma Rodriguez walked through the front doors at exactly 8:15, the same time she'd arrived every day for the past year and a half. But everything else was completely different. Students stopped talking when they saw her. Some smiled and nodded approvingly. Others stared with undisguised curiosity. A few looked genuinely intimidated, as if they were seeing her for the first time. The hallways seemed wider somehow, less oppressive. Emma realized it was because she was walking differently. Her shoulders were back, her head was up, and she moved with the confident stride of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. The invisible weight she'd been carrying for months was gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time: self-respect. Her first class was AP History, with Mr. Palmer. Chen, no relation to Marcus despite sharing a name. As Emma took her usual seat near the back of the classroom, she noticed several students turning to look at her. But these weren't the pitying glances she'd grown accustomed to. There was respect in their eyes, even admiration. "Miss Rodriguez, Mr. Chen," said as the bell rang. "It's good to have you back." Emma nodded politely. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I trust you're caught up on the reading?" He continued, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the entire school wasn't buzzing with stories about what Emma had done to Marcus in the cafeteria. "Yes, sir," Emma replied. "I finished the chapters on the civil rights movement over the weekend." The lesson proceeded normally, but Emma could feel the change in how her classmates related to her. When Mr. Boyd gets hurt, Chen asked questions about passive resistance versus active resistance. Several students glanced in Emma's direction, as if her recent experience had given her special insight into the topic. When he discussed the courage required to stand up against injustice, the parallel to Emma's situation was obvious to everyone in the room. During the break between classes, Emma was surprised when Jessica Wong approached her in the hallway. Jessica was one of the more popular students, someone who had always been friendly but had never sought out Emma's company before. "Hey, Emma," Jessica said, falling into step beside her. "I just wanted to say that what you did last week was incredible. Marcus had been picking on my little brother David for weeks, and none of us knew how to stop it. David saw the videos of what happened, and he said it was like watching a superhero movie." Emma felt a flush of embarrassment. "I wasn't trying to be anyone's hero. I was just defending myself." "Maybe," Jessica said with a smile. But sometimes that's the same thing. Similar interactions happen throughout the morning. Students Emma barely knew were stopping to thank her, sharing their own stories about Marcus's behavior, expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to him. It was overwhelming and gratifying at the same time. Lunchtime arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Emma knew that returning to the cafeteria would be the real test of how much things had changed. She packed her usual lunch and grabbed her art supplies, planning to spend the period sketching as she always had. But when she entered the cafeteria, she discovered that her usual corner table was occupied by flowers, cards, and small gifts that students had left for her. There were dozens of notes thanking her for standing up to Marcus, drawings inspired by her artwork, and even a small trophy someone had made that read, "Defender of the Defenseless." Emma stood staring at the impromptu shrine, not sure how to react. She'd never wanted this kind of attention, had never sought to become a symbol of anything. But as she read the heartfelt messages from students who had been bullied, threatened, or intimidated by Marcus and his friends, she began to understand the impact of what she had done. "You can sit with us if you want," said a voice behind her. Emma turned to see Sarah Kim, a quiet girl from her chemistry class, standing with a group of students who had always sat at the tables near the windows. "We saved you a spot." For the first time in her Lincoln High career, Emma didn't eat lunch alone. She sat with Sarah's group, which turned out to include several other students who had been targets of Marcus's bullying. They shared stories, laughed about the absurdity of high school social hierarchies, and discussed their plans for the future. "The weird thing is," said David Martinez, a sophomore who had been one of Marcus's frequent targets, "I'm not even mad at him anymore. I kind of feel sorry for him. He spent so much energy making other people feel bad, and now he's the one who's hurt and alone." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop hurting other people." "Well, mission accomplished," said Rachel Thompson, a junior who had been considering transferring schools to escape Marcus's harassment. "Jake Morrison told me that Marcus has been crying in the hospital, not just from the pain, but because he finally understands what it feels like to be powerless and scared." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Miss Patricia Kellerman, Emma's art teacher. "Emma, could I speak with you for a moment?" Emma followed Miss Kellerman to a quiet corner of the cafeteria. "I wanted to let you know about something exciting," the teacher said with a smile. "I submitted some of your artwork to the regional high school art competition without telling you, because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. You won first place in the illustration category." Emma's eyes widened. "What? Which drawings?" "The Warrior series," Ms. Kellerman said. "The judges were particularly impressed with the piece you were working on last week, the lone fighter standing against multiple enemies. They said it showed remarkable technical skill and emotional depth." Emma thought about the drawing that had been in her sketchbook when Marcus grabbed it, the image that had seemed to trigger his final escalation of harassment. "That's ironic. More than ironic, Ms. Kellerman said. It's perfect. Your art has always been about inner strength and resilience. What happened last week just proved that your drawings were never fantasy. They were preparation." The recognition was gratifying, but Emma was more pleased by what it represented. Her art had been validated not as a form of escapism, but as a legitimate expression of strength and determination. The warriors in her drawings weren't fictional characters. They were reflections of who she had always been inside, waiting for the right moment to emerge. After lunch, Emma had to report to Principal Davidson's office for a meeting about her return to school. She found him looking much more relaxed than he had the previous week, though still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention the incident had brought to Lincoln High. "Emma," Principal Davidson said, "I want you to know that the school board met over the weekend and decided that your suspension was sufficient consequence for your involvement in the altercation. You won't face any additional disciplinary action." Emma nodded. "What about Marcus?" "Marcus will be out of school for at least 6 weeks while he recovers from surgery," Principal Davidson said carefully. "When he returns, he'll be on strict probation. Any further incidents will result in immediate expulsion. We're also implementing new anti-bullying policies and hiring an additional counselor to work specifically with students who are experiencing harassment." The changes were more extensive than Emma had expected. The school was taking concrete steps to prevent future incidents, to create an environment where students like her wouldn't have to suffer in silence for months before finding relief. "There's something else," Principal Davidson continued. "We've received several calls from martial arts schools in the area. They're offering you scholarships to train with them. Apparently, your technique in the cafeteria impressed some very knowledgeable people." Emma's heart jumped. The possibility of returning to serious martial arts training had seemed impossible given her family's financial situation. But if scholarships were available, if her demonstration of skill had opened doors that had been closed, I'd like the contact information, Emma said quietly. I've missed training more than I realized. That afternoon, Emma's parents picked her up from school to take her to visit one of the martial arts schools that had reached out. Master Liu's academy was a traditional kung fu and jiu-jitsu school located in the next town over, and Master Liu himself had called personally to offer Emma a full scholarship. Master Liu was a small, elderly Chinese man whose calm demeanor reminded Emma of her first instructor back in Phoenix. He watched Emma demonstrate some basic forms and techniques, occasionally offering minor corrections but mostly observing her movement and attitude.
You have been without proper instruction for too long, Master Liu said finally.
Your techniques are sound, but you've developed some bad habits from training alone. More importantly, you carry anger and conflict in your body. Martial arts should bring peace, not turmoil. Emma bowed respectfully. I understand, Master Liu. I don't want to be angry anymore. I want to be strong without being aggressive, confident without being arrogant.
Master Liu smiled. That is wisdom.
Strength without humility is merely violence. Humility without strength is merely weakness. True martial arts teaches us to be both strong and humble, to fight only when necessary, and to find peace even in conflict. Emma began training at Master Liu's academy the following week. The structured environment and expert instruction felt like coming home after months of exile. But more importantly, the philosophical aspects of her training helped her process what had happened with Marcus and what it meant for her future. Back at Lincoln High, the social dynamics continued to shift. Marcus's absence had created a power vacuum that was being filled not by another bully, but by students who were using their influence to create positive change. Jessica Wong started an anti-bullying club. David Martinez organized study groups for struggling students. Rachel Thompson began a peer mediation program to help resolve conflicts before they escalated. Emma found herself at the center of these changes, but in a way that felt natural rather than overwhelming. Students came to her for advice about standing up for themselves, and she was able to share not just techniques for physical self-defense, but strategies for building confidence and inner strength. 6 weeks after the cafeteria incident, Marcus Chen returned to Lincoln High School. His arm was still in a brace, and he would need physical therapy for several more months before regaining full mobility. But the biggest change in Marcus wasn't physical. The arrogant, cruel teenager who had terrorized other students was gone, replaced by someone who seemed smaller, quieter, and genuinely humbled. On his first day back, Marcus approached Emma at her lunch table. The entire cafeteria went silent, expecting another confrontation. But Marcus's posture was completely different. His head was down, his shoulders were slumped, and his voice was barely audible. Emma, Marcus said, not looking directly at her. I wanted to apologize. Not because anyone told me to, but because I need you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. I spent weeks in the hospital thinking about all the people I hurt, all the pain I caused because I thought being cruel made me strong. Emma studied his face carefully. There was no trace of the arrogance that had defined Marcus for so long. The experience had clearly changed him profoundly. I accept your apology, Emma said quietly. But the people you really need to apologize to are all the students you bullied before me. And you need to prove that you've changed through your actions, not just your words. Marcus nodded. I know. I've been making a list of everyone I can remember hurting. I want to apologize to all of them, and I want to find ways to make things right. Over the following weeks, Marcus kept his word. He apologized to dozens of students, some of whom had graduated and had to be contacted through social media. He volunteered for community service projects. He even started seeing a therapist to address the insecurities and family pressures that had contributed to his bullying behavior. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Marcus still struggled with his temper sometimes, still caught himself falling into old patterns of thinking. But he was genuinely working to become a better person, and the school community gradually began to accept that people could change if they were willing to do the work. As Emma's senior year progressed, she found herself becoming a different kind of leader than Marcus had ever been. Where Marcus had ruled through fear and intimidation, Emma led through example and encouragement. Students came to her not because they were afraid of her, but because they trusted her judgment and valued her perspective. Her artwork evolved too. The warrior drawings that had once been an escape from reality became celebrations of inner strength and resilience. She created a series of illustrations showing ordinary people discovering their own power, quiet individuals finding their voices, and communities coming together to protect their most vulnerable members. The regional art competition had opened doors to college scholarships and art programs, that Emma had never dreamed of pursuing. Her guidance counselor helped her apply to schools with strong art departments and excellent academic reputations. For the first time since moving to this small Colorado town, Emma began to envision a future that excited her. Master Liu's training had restored not just Emma's physical skills, but her confidence and peace of mind. She learned advanced techniques and forms, but more importantly, she learned to carry herself with the quiet assurance that came from knowing she could defend herself while hoping she'd never need to. On graduation day, Emma Rodriguez walked across the stage to receive her diploma with a full scholarship to the Colorado Institute of Art waiting for her in the fall. Her parents beamed from the audience, proud not just of her academic achievements, but of the young woman she had become. Marcus Chen graduated as well, his grades having improved dramatically during his final semester. He had been accepted to a community college where he planned to study social work, hoping to eventually help other teenagers who were struggling with anger and insecurity issues. In her valedictorian speech, Emma spoke about the importance of standing up for yourself and others, about finding strength in unexpected places, and about the power of art to transform pain into beauty. She didn't specifically mention the cafeteria incident, but everyone in the audience understood that her words came from lived experience. Sometimes we think that being quiet means being weak, Emma said, looking out at her classmates and their families. But I've learned that there's a difference between choosing silence and being silenced. True strength isn't about dominating others or proving how tough you are. It's about knowing who you are, standing up for what's right, and using your power to protect people who can't protect themselves. After graduation, Emma stayed in touch with many of her classmates, watching as they pursued their own dreams and faced their own challenges. The changes that had begun with a single moment of standing up to a bully continued to ripple outward, creating a legacy of courage and compassion that would influence Lincoln High School for years to come. Emma's story became part of the school's unofficial history, told to new students as an example of how one person's courage could change everything. But for Emma herself, the real victory wasn't in the dramatic moment when she defended herself against Marcus. It was in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had found her voice, claimed her power, and used both to make the world a little bit safer for people like her. The quiet girl in the corner had learned that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is refusing to stay quiet when it matters most. And in learning that lesson, she had taught everyone around her something about the true nature of strength, courage, and the transformative power of standing up for what's right.